We talked a little bit about geologic time, and we're kind of shifting gears now and going into more of a historical aspect of geology. So what we would do with historical aspects is we look at fossils, okay, and we have fossils then that, are in rocks, and the picture, the story that's told with having fossils together with the rock type, you can get kind of an idea of what the paleo environment was at the time. So what we're going to do in this section of the course is we're going to look at fossils, we're going to look at the animals that were around, we're going to look at the rocks that they are preserved in, and then we're going to be able to come up with not only the age of the rock based on those fossils, but also what the environment was at the time that those animals lived. Now, if we were to start out with a rock here, like so, we have a limestone. You can see that's that dove gray color, and it's got a bunch of fossils in it. And so that's what we're basically talking about. This had to have formed in some kind of, area that was warm to make it limestone, and it had to have a lot of life going on. And so therefore, putting this all together, we can get a good idea of what went on when this was being deposited. We could do the same thing if we look at individual fossils. So there are a bunch of different types of fossils that will take on different appearances or just to be able to do certain things. So for example, this is the same animal, really. This is what is called a brachiopod. There's many years ago. There's still actually a couple of them around, but they were around 500 million years ago. And you can see that some of them, they look quite different. This one is very round, and it has a very tight shape to it, as opposed to this one, which is kind of flat, okay? And therefore, these serve different functions. To have a tight, tough one with the ridges on it to give you some protection meant that it could roll around in the surf, okay? You could have waves beating against it, and all those strong ridges on it would protect it so that the waves wouldn't break it. This one would never survive waves, and so this one sat up on top of mud. And so these things kind of evolved in different directions to best take advantage of their different environments that they might be in. And so therefore we could say something about the environment based on what the fossil looked like. So they're just looking at these body fossils, which are, body fossil is something that you actually see what the animal looked like. We can tell something about it. In addition to that, we might have something like this, which is a very soft, fine, feature. This is sitting in a shale, and it was a very fragile animal that could settle down and didn't have to worry about a lot of energy. Okay, and so that might be another thing. We could also look at things where we have plant fossils, and clearly plant fossils had to have been on land because you don't have plants really living under the ocean like this, and so this was in some kind of a swamp where the plants died. So things like that can tell us something about the animal. This, of course, is a nautilus, and you can see in here that it has a bunch of chambers inside of it in addition to the large shell, and this one was so that it could float. It became buoyant with those chambers. And so therefore, by looking at some of these features of the animals, we can say something about what the environment was like where they lived. Now you can also do that the same thing by using rocks, okay? And we already talked about identifying rocks. So for example, if you have a nice clean sandstone like this is like beach sand. So this would be comparable to a beach sand environment. And that's the type of thing you would look at as opposed to something like this, which is a conglomerate, okay? And with a conglomerate, you can see we had a much higher energy region that we went through, and it's red, so it was probably terrestrial. In other words, it was not a marine deposit, whereas this probably was. And so therefore, by looking at the features of them, in addition, we just saw shale and limestone, but just by the rock type alone, we can see those types of things. So using the fossils, the rock type, and then we can use what are called sedimentary structures. Sedimentary structures might be like ripples on the top of rocks. You might have seen ripples on a beach if you get there early in the morning. We have these preserved in the rocks. And so this meant there was some kind of water flow to make these. Here, this is red, so it was water flow that was in kind of a terrestrial environment. If we look closely at these things, by cutting them apart, we can see that there's cross-bedding on them. And cross-bedding also tells us that there was a flowing water. Okay, so by looking at some of these things, by looking at these which are called sedimentary structures, combined with the rock type, we can see maybe where they formed. Here is another example. These are what are called desiccation cracks or mud cracks. Okay, and therefore this had to be outside, which was wet and dry periods back and forth to get the desiccation features. And so therefore we have a bunch of things that we're going to put together to talk about the paleoenvironment. So this is going to be a paleoenvironmental study in addition to seeing what age the animals are. Now we know something about paleoenvironment, but what we really need to do is identify these fossils. We can't just go off and say, oh, well, they look generally like this. We have to tell exactly what animal that was. And if we know what animal it was, we'll know when it lived, in addition to what kind of environment that it wanted to live in. So what we're going to do then is kind of look at some of these things. Now, first of all, we'll start off with some of the early stuff. These are what we call Paleozoic fossils. So they started out about 535 million years ago and ended at about 250. That's the age range we're looking at. Now, right at the beginning, we started this big explosion of life that had all these shelled animals. And one of the big ones back in this early period, which is what is called the Cambrian, we had what was called the guide fossil for the Cambrian. Those are trilobites. These are little animals with legs on the side, a ridge down the back, a head in the front. They look very similar to what we see in today as horseshoe crabs. And that's the way they did. They ran around the ocean bottoms. So we had a lot of those back in the Cambrian. These are what trilobites are. Obviously, they're filter feeders. They had to be able to run around the ground. And so we can tell something about their environment. And if we have a lot of them, definitely we're talking Cambrian period. Other fossils we have at that time were called brachiopods. Okay, brachiopods look like clams for all the world, except clams are skewed. Okay, brachiopods are what we call bilaterally symmetric. In other words, I could cut a line down the middle and everything on one side is exactly the same as what's on the other side. So we can have different ones. You can see these are like bat-like wings that you have where you can cut it right down the middle. This side is exactly the opposite, the mirror of the other side. And that's what makes it a brachiopod as opposed to, say, a clam, which is what is called a mollusk. And so therefore we have a bunch of different types. You can see we go from very small ones to kind of big robust ones, very fancy front ends, which is called the commissure, as opposed to big flat ones. These are all what we call brachiopods. Okay, and so those, again, these are individual animals that were very common during the Cambrian. Another one that came up during the Cambrian is this one. This was a relative to that big nautilus you saw before. This was called a nautiloid, and instead of being curved like the nautilus, these had straight shells. Okay, so each one of the lines on here was a chamber. Okay, and that chamber could be filled with air or it could be deflated, and these things could then swim. The animal itself was like a squid. Okay, it had tentacles on it, probably could squirt ink like a squid, and they swam around in the ocean in that regard. And so you can see even in here we've got one where you can actually see inside of it. The chamber cutoffs are missing, but nonetheless these were hollow. Okay, and the animal only lived up in the front. So these were what we would call nautiloids. Now, in addition to that, there are many other different types of animals that we can have. Something that maybe that sat down on the ground by itself was this solitary animal, which is a coral, a type of coral. Now, coral we see today are never solitary. They're always in groups. When these first started, they were solitary, and this is what is called a rugose coral. You can see in the top it's got fanning pieces on the top, in addition to the side to it, all of the shapes that come into this. They are also called horn corals. Okay, and so the horn corals would grow solitary, but enough of them together to make a reef structure. Now these would be succeeded by more corals that look like this. These are what are called tabulate corals, and you can see there's all different spots on the top. Each one of these would hold an individual animal that would grow up, and it would have this entablature on the side where it would grow each step up. So this was now a community type animal as opposed to the solitary one that we would see before. Other ones that are community type was something like this. Now, this is a bryozoan. Okay, and this again was a little community of animals that could filter feed out of the water. There's a couple of different types of these. Some of them are very fine in general, so these had to be in relatively quiet water. Another one that's a specific type is called the Archimedes because it looks like an Archimedes coil. Okay, but nonetheless, that's also a type of a bryozoan. So that would be another different group of these community type animals as opposed to the solitary ones. Back to some solitary ones. This one is what is called an echinoid. Okay, and you may have seen these today. We have them as sand dollars. Okay, this is the same type of thing. Sea urchins, they would have little spines sticking out of them and they'd be able to walk along on the ocean bottom. This is a fossilized sea urchin, basically, called an echinoid. In addition to that, we had these, which I showed you before. These are what are called graptolites. We're not really sure a whole lot about these things, but you find them on very deep ocean bottom sediments. Okay, and they were very common during the Ordovician period. Nonetheless, that's where most of them come from. Other things we have are what are called sponges. Okay, porifera. And porifera are basically the sponges that we have today. These again came around during the Paleozoic, mostly in the Silurian period. However, again, other ones, you can see all of the pores that stick out on the top, a general sponge-like shape. So these porifera, again, are different types of sponges. There are also things that were called, that are like sea lilies. And these have little heads on them called the calyx, where these would be attached to almost a flower-like appendages where they could filter feed back and forth. And that's how they would sit in the water. They were additionally connected to the ground by a stem, almost looks like a roll of lifesavers, where the head would attach to the top of it, and that's where they would filter out. So sometimes you can just see these little like lifesavers in the rock. These are the stems of those what are called crinoids. So these are like sea lilies today. We call them crinoids from when they were back then. The other thing we could also have is if we have plants, and plants obviously occur in swamps. These we would expect to be associated with either these black shales or maybe coals. And that's how, again, gives us something in the environment that we can just identify what the plant looks like. Okay, so this lab is going to have two components to it then. You're going to be able to identify these fossils and you're going to have to do a little bit of detailed work on them. So we're going to have you sketch out those fossils and be able to identify them carefully, because a lot of things can look very similar but aren't quite the same. So it involves a lot of detailed observations, and then you take those observations, you identify your fossils. Once you've identified your fossils, then you can decide what age the rock is, and then with your information on the rocks, we can put the whole picture together and decide what the age of the area was, what the environment was like you were depositing things in. These can be very important for as far as finding oil and things like that. We have to know all of these pieces of information to be able to make use of this in our economic use of geology, in addition to just being interesting. Okay, now that we've got all of the information we need, let's see how we exactly have to do today. And there's a bunch of different things. First of all, we're going to identify rocks, okay? And you have a chart on your lab where you just fill in the rock name. We've done that before, so I'm not going to really spend much time showing you how to do it. You've done it, you know how to do it. Okay, what we'll take a look at, though, is how to deal with these fossils, because this is a little bit new. Okay, and first of all, what we have is we can take an unknown sample, and here I got a nice tiny one that's real hard to see. But what you do is you're going to look very carefully at it. Even if you have to use a hand lens, just look at it very carefully and then try to draw a picture. And we have a space in here for which you can draw pictures, and you just draw in what the sample looks like. What I'm doing then to drawing in is I'm making a detailed sketch. I'm going to look very carefully at it and see exactly what it looks like, and I'm going to draw a nice detailed sketch on my form. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a handout. You will all get handouts in the lab. There's probably one per table of a bunch of different fossils. Okay, and so what you're going to do is after you make your drawing, and the drawing helps you to concentrate on the small fine detail, then you'll take the list of the pictures that you're given and you'll try to match the two together. So this is a page, the one I have here is definitely a trilobite. Okay, and so what I'm doing is I'm taking the trilobite page and I'm going to match my drawing here to one of the ones on here and figure out what trilobite it is. And in this case, the one I've gotten is what's called agnostis. Okay, so my sample here, this little tiny thing, is agnostis, and I can see it's clearly different than the other ones on the page, though you'll see that the ones on the page, some of them are quite similar, so that detail really matters to be able to tell them apart. The agnostis was around during the Cambrian period. So we can write agnostis on here, agnostis. We can figure out that it was just a Cambrian age thing. We want to put some identifying features on here, and this is for you later on. When you take an exam, again, we're going to have an exam with a bunch of fossils on it. You're going to have to be able to identify them without the help of that book. So therefore, it's a good idea to write down some identifying features in addition to just drawing the picture. Once we have that drawn in, what we're going to use next is what is called a range chart. And on this range chart, we can put in my sample number over here, and I can write in what my name of my fossil was. So I'll write in agnostis, and all we have to worry about here is that it was in the Cambrian period. So what that does, by coloring in that little box there saying that we're in Cambrian period, what that tells me is now I know that the rock that I'm dealing with was a Cambrian age rock. It had no other choice. Now in some other cases, we might have two fossils that are different ages, but between the overlap of them, we might be able to uniquely identify the period that they were formed as well. So we can have a single fossil telling us what age it is, or we can have an overlapping range, as it's called, to see what period it is. That's how you do a range chart. Ultimately, we have a map on the top of the lab. And in that map, it kind of goes through and shows you a bunch of different fossil localities and things like that. And we can go along and see how things have changed over time. We know which way is up because we know the age, so we know where the younger units are and which is the older units, and that follows that principle of stratigraphic superposition. So we can see which is getting younger, which is getting older. We can judge how the environment has changed with time, and we can even make a cross-section of this showing how things have changed with time. So ultimately you will kind of take all this information, the ages, the paleo environment, and try to put it into a little story. And so that's how the end of this lab goes. After we do all of these 3 or 4 different things, we're going to make a story and tell exactly what happened in that area as time went on back during the Paleozoic era.